Welcome to the Compact Podcast. Today we'll discuss who the real threat to democracy is, the Democrats' advantage on abortion, and the new country western album from Beyonce. I'm joined by Geoff Shullenberger and Nina Power, and I'm Matthew Schmitz. So RFK Jr., the long-shot third-party presidential candidate, argued last Tuesday that not Donald Trump, but instead Joe Biden is the greatest threat we face to democracy. RFK cited censorship that he had faced when questioning certain narratives around public health, really pointing to a kind of opinion shaping and censorship apparatus that has arisen around the notions of disinformation and misinformation. A lot of people were angry at that, said this was a sign that Kennedy is a stalking horse for the dark anti-democratic designs of Donald Trump. What's our panel think?
Well, I can talk to what's happening in Scotland, which maybe there's some interesting parallels vis-a-vis democracy and censorship. So recently, Scotland have just introduced a new, very poorly put together law around hate speech, which has attracted a lot of attention. And this is being put forward by the Scottish National Party, who was sort of originally set up as a kind of sovereign pro-independence party, but have since turned into some really quite censorious authoritarian um, outfit. And this new hate speech legislation, which was passed on April the 1st, so April Fool's Day, will potentially involve the prosecution of people for things as vague as stirring up trouble. And we already have this idea of a non-crime hate incident. And it seems very clear that already there have been sort of several thousand reports of hate incidents. And I think we're increasingly aware that basically these are not crimes of misstating fact, but really things that people object to hearing. And the more the definition of hate becomes a kind of subjective perception of offence or someone else being offended either, the less reason we have to defend against these incursions into censorship. So I think Kennedy has a point here, because it's often these supposedly more democratic, compassionate, lefty liberal positions that are really pushing forward this extremely censorious hate speech legislation or arguments against disinformation. We've had various disinformation units being set up also by the BBC, and they just get things wrong. I mean, they it's not really about whether a statement is true anymore. It's about whether it's unpleasant to hear or whether a group of people will object to hearing it. And this is disastrous for any critical thinking about science, any statements of fact, any open philosophical public discussion we might have about reality. Kennedy has a point, and I think we should not give the Democrats a free pass on censorship, but be extremely wary wherever it's coming from, because we're looking at extremely authoritarian legislation coming in everywhere.
Yeah, so it's very ubiquitous, it seems, around the world to, claim that your opponents in democratic political contests are threats to democracy. It seems to become a sort of standard talking point. And so, it's worth noting Kennedy, he's already kind of responding to a pre-existing claim, right, which is the endlessly repeated claim that Trump is a threat to democracy. So, he's sort of turning that around against the very people who are advancing that that warning. And I mean, I agree there's something to it. It's clearly the case that, the claims about a threat to democracy have been used in various ways to restrict various democratic rights. That if we think about this sort of various attempts to influence social media, to deplatform certain people and views, that's clearly correlated to this idea that sort of democracy is at risk. And so the irony here is that once you invoke a sort of existential emergency to the continuation of the political system, that provides a pretext for emergency measures that that by definition sort of suspend or undermine certain guarantees that might have been taken for granted. The origin point of this debate, I think, already kind of reveals that there's something to this position, which is that the repeated invocations of threats to democracy are themselves part of this kind of legitimation of an emergency rule that by definition involves a kind of suspension of norms, or sort of indefinite redefinition of what our rights might be. So yeah, I think there's something to that. There's also just the question of what people mean when they talk about democracy, which I think nobody can quite agree on what it means. Sometimes it seems to refer to opposite things. In general, it would seem that there are sort of two major ways that this kind of warning is advanced. One is usually that it means that there's a removal of certain sort of checks and balances built into the system. And I mean, ironically, these are themselves often sort of anti-democratic insofar as they mitigate the influence of the voter. That there's, I mean, just a simple example is like, okay, so what people fear is that someone, perhaps Donald Trump, I mean, I believe I saw this, somebody warned in the past couple of days that if we let Donald Trump back into office, he'll never leave. He won't accept his term ending. What this sort of there's a threat to democracy argument neglects is that term limits are themselves or can themselves be understood as anti-democratic, right? Because they deprive citizens of the right to continue voting for the same candidate. If should they so wish. And in fact, of course, they were imposed because FDR was able to, essentially be reelected seemingly indefinitely. So, it's clear in that case that the imposition of presidential term limits is a kind of anti-populist and fundamentally anti-democratic move. And in fact, this is something I wrote about in the context of El Salvador. It's very common in Latin America to have presidents term limited to one term. It's ubiquitous across the region. This is clearly something that was put in place by elites who were concerned about these sort of populist leaders who basically could just keep getting reelected, along the lines of Perón and various other, Vargas in Brazil. But this problem that repeated itself was that you would have these leaders who were just incredibly popular and therefore could in effect become presidents for life through completely democratic means. In El Salvador, this, at the moment seems to be the case, possibly with Bukele, right? Who just completely flouted the ban on re-election and successfully ran for a second term. So anyway, this is just an example of how a lot of these debates about who or what is a threat to democracy don't really clarify very much. And so to that, I suppose that would sort of be my criticism of taking up this talking point, which is that it's often so vague in terms of what it refers to that it will sometimes even completely reverse the reality where it turns out that the thing that's a threat to democracy is actually the more purely democratic thing, and such as indefinite reelection of a candidate, whereas the things that are supposedly being defended as bedrocks of democracy are actually checks and balances that are designed to mitigate the popular will and limit the choices of voters. So these are pretty complicated questions, and unfortunately, this debate is usually pretty vacuous because it refuses to even acknowledge any of these complications.
I think for someone like RFK Jr., who before he became a third-party presidential candidate associated with conspiracy theories and the right and all these bad things, was known as an environmental activist, kind of defender of clean water, of natural kind of and of nature more generally. I think for him, probably democracy has something to do with the vision evoked in Henry David Thoreau's classic essay Walking, which is a defense of freedom and wildness, and really kind of proposes a certain connection with nature and ability to be free from law and social control as kind of democratic ideal for the young nation. I think for someone like Kennedy, something like that is kind of expresses the spirit of democracy, whereas for many of our kind of official defenders of democracy who speak in outlets like The Atlantic, for them, democracy has more to do with legal procedures, with the political and economic dominance of people who are educated in the right institutions and profess the right values. So it is really a project of law and civilization, and even to a very great degree, control. Whereas for Kennedy, what the democratic ethos is something close to the opposite. It's about kind of freedom from control and constraint, and a connection with nature, and a certain even rejection of civilization. I'm sure I'm overplaying this, but I think it just goes to show exactly what Geoff said, that we can mean really different things when we talk about democracy. Speaking of democracy, new poll came out this week from the Wall Street Journal showing that in 7 swing states, Donald Trump enjoys advantages on basically every highly salient issue, whether it's the economy, the border, foreign policy. But Joe Biden does have one trump card. That's abortion. Voters trust him more on that issue, and Democrats are taking heart from the fact that abortion is going to be on the ballot in various jurisdictions. So just as gay marriage may have once helped George W. Bush win presidential elections, abortion may provide a lifeline to Biden. In particular, in Florida, we'll have a ballot measure on abortion restrictions, and Democrats see an opening there. One thing that I'll just observe here is that for a long time, opponents of abortion decried what they called the judicial usurpation of politics, and really planted their flag on the idea that the democratic process had been circumvented by the judicial imposition of Roe v. Wade. And they called for returning abortion to the democratic political process by overturning Roe v. Wade. It seems now that that democratic appeal that was once made by abortion opponents, well, I think it was very far from insincere, and hasn't been completely discarded now, has really lost its political usefulness.
It seems clear that the overall trend is that these ballot referendums and so on are favorable to the pro-choice side. And, that there was a case in Ohio, another, one-time swing state that has gone, quite fully into the GOP camp in presidential elections, like Florida, but did, vote in in a more pro-choice direction when it came to a statewide referendum. And so it seems likely, based on the previous experiences, that this will be the case in Florida too. And I think that what that means as far as presidential politics is unclear. I mean, there have been cases of Florida, I think, voting in the more kind of liberal direction. For example, I believe there was a felon enfranchisement referendum that basically allowed people with felony convictions to vote again after having served their time. This was generally favored by the Democrats, but it passed in Florida in a year in which Republicans otherwise pretty much swept the major races. So it may be that there's the possibility of this referendum going in the Democrats' direction, while the Republicans continue to be electorally dominant, which I think does then raise another question, which is Trump has sort of carved out in a way sort of unique position within the party. As far as he will kind of boast whenever anybody asks him about his having been the best president for the pro-life that the pro-life movement has ever had, because of the judges he appointed and the fact that Roe v. Wade was in fact overturned. So he will kind of take credit for that and say I'm your guy. But on the other hand, he repeatedly has sort of excoriated Republicans for taking too maximalist of a position on this, and has sort of, seemingly voiced support. I suppose you could argue for this older position, but also for a states' rights position that essentially there should be that the end of Roe v. Wade means that it returns to the states, and states should have the right to decide what level of restrictions they want to have through the democratic process. And so, it's in a way quite odd that he's and that he has really attacked the sort of maximalist position as a sort of loser position that will damage the Republicans' electoral prospects. And so, he's in kind of an odd position. I'm not privy to, or I haven't paid particularly close attention, but in a way it's quite surprising that there isn't more direct confrontation or tension over this, which has been sort of a defining issue of social conservatism, and where you do have Trump basically seeming to favor something like a settlement that you see in many European countries, where there's a relatively liberal policy prior to around the first trimester, and then significant restrictions in access to abortion kick in after that. So that seems to be what he repeatedly favors. To the extent that he has a position beyond it should go back to the states, it seems to be something like that, which oddly has been basically the position that is least discussed in the U.S. context, even though it's pretty much quite commonplace among both sort of liberal and conservative parties elsewhere. So that does seem to be the position he's advancing, but nonetheless, there hasn't been a huge sort of reckoning on the Republican side as far as how to approach this issue, because it would seem you have within it a sort of very strong and influential and very effective, organizationally effective pro-life movement, and then you have people who might not approve of the sort of maximalist positions of that faction of the party, but have never really vocally carved out another position. I mean, of course, you've always had a handful of like pro-choice Republicans. I think one example is Lisa Murkowski of Alaska. You had the two, I think, Olympia Snow and Susan Collins, and so you had a handful of these like pro-choice Republicans and in a few states, including several senators. But actually, what you didn't really have was like somebody articulating what Trump seems to be articulating, which is like a proposal for like a new sort of more moderate settlement around the issue. I don't know. It's oddly. It's both. It will be salient in the election, and that's obviously something Trump is very cognizant of. But there doesn't seem to be a shifting of the paradigm or a confrontation within the Republican coalition, as far as I can tell, about this issue, which is interesting. That there is this shift in the leading candidates, the position the leading candidate will take, but at the same time, it doesn't seem to be pushing anything in a clear direction.
Mm-hmm. I think from the other side, I was surprised after the overturning of Roe v. Wade that there wasn't more kind of militant protest. I mean, there was some, but it wasn't as big a deal as I thought it might be. It threatened to be coming from the left, and I think it's interesting historically to wonder why pro-choice, so-called pro-choice position is left coded. Because if you look at the history of feminism, abortion was not always pushed by feminists. So, like in the first wave, many of the women opposed abortion because it seemed to give men the opportunity to abandon their responsibilities. It's only with the second wave that you have a particular understanding of freedom and choice, and the idea that sort of pregnancy is operating as a kind of imposition within a sort of patriarchal system. And then I think we move to a kind of third wave position, which is just that it's simply a consumer choice. It's something like that, right? Like it doesn't even have these other metaphysical commitments to freedom or concepts like patriarchy, but rather it's simply whether it's convenient or not in many cases. And in a sense, none of these positions are particularly left or right coded. They obviously invoke deep emotion, and they are very tied to religious perspectives or how we might understand life more broadly. This is also obviously taking place in the context of discussions around end of life. State intervention, like the MAID program in Canada, and in Britain, we're currently being forced to have this discussion about whether, older people should have the right to use the state to die, and so on. And I think these are all kind of symptoms of a certain turning away from these deeper metaphysical questions, but they're recoding at the level of the state. So I actually think derogating this question to the state level is actually a mark of maturity, politically speaking, because it's really up to the people in each place how they feel about this. There used to be this kind of joke where people would say, well, if you don't want an abortion, then don't have one. Thus, suggesting that those people who are pro-life shouldn't necessarily be engaging in sex. But I wonder if we're moving to a kind of almost post-sex society in some ways, in which this question of abortion might shift again. I'm not sure whether the abortion rates have really changed that much in the wake of Roe v. Wade. Maybe you guys know how it stands.
They've increased, in fact.
They've increased.
I don't know, but I mean, I think it depends on the region, but the overall number has increased, as I understand it.
Right. So nothing followed substantially, or, I mean, how do you read that stat?
I really haven't looked into it. One thing we do know is that abortion is far more common for women who aren't married.
Mm-hmm.
So if rates of marriage are declining, as we know they are, and if people who are married are having fewer children, that would be one thing that would increase abortion rates just in relative terms, because potentially more pregnancies would be, proportionally speaking, would be occurring to people who aren't married. I don't really know if that's the driver here, but that's one thing that, as birth rates fall and as marriages trail off, if it becomes harder to really, if it's becoming much harder economically to live out this vaunted model of kind of responsible reproduction and planned parenthood, right, where you're having a child after getting married and with sufficient financial resources, having purchased a home, and being sure that you can not only physically reproduce but engage in an active class reproduction. If that's becoming much harder to do, I would tend to think that proportionally more pregnancies will occur, in kind of non-bourgeois settings where that script isn't being followed, and pregnancies like that are much more likely to end in an abortion.
Yeah, I think there. It's a bit ambiguous. It seems that in some states the fertility did it, which have enacted bans, like Texas, fertility did increase. So in other words, abortions basically disappeared and fertility did increase. But it seems that in some instances the increase may have to do with, what Nina brought up. That there wasn't sort of a hugely militant, I don't know, in the form of street protests and so on. But I think the response did take the form of these kind of NGOs and so on, basically, first of all, getting a huge influx of donations. And second of all, basically increasing their sort of activities, particularly in saying, I think many of them were sort of soliciting funds on the grounds that they had to help women from these states where it had been banned go to states where it was not. And I think, there was this kind of, new sort of missionary fervor and going out and ensuring that, that access was expanded, in spite of the state level bans. And so basically one possible reason for the increase is that there was actually a kind of dramatic escalation of these efforts to, basically help, both publicize and, provide access in the wake of the Supreme Court ruling. So, it, in a sense, is kind of another illustration of how, as soon as one political victory, as soon as a political victory occurs on one side, there's always this kind of mobilization of the NGO sector of the other side. So I think that's one theory that I've seen out there, but so it would suggest there was this kind of mobilization. It's just it took more the form of this kind of mobilization of NGO resources and volunteers and so on, which may have led to this slight increase, despite the state level bans.
Finally, there's been a great deal of controversy around Beyonce's latest album, Cowboy Carter. Beyonce, has donned a cowboy hat, mounted a horse, and taken an American flag, Old Glory, in hand to market this album. It's, not a new phenomenon. Ray Charles before her went country. And of course, there's a long history of Black musicians in country music, not just prominent like Ray Charles, but obscure like Al Downing, one name that comes to mind. The most notable thing about this has been that the release of the album has been an occasion to condemn country music stations, country music fans as insufficiently open, accepting, frankly, kind of downright bigoted and racist for failing to be sufficiently enthusiastic about this new album. In particular, one radio station in Oklahoma was condemned after they responded to a fan who requested that they play Beyonce's music by saying, well, we play country music, so we're not going to play that. The station then walked it back, said that they didn't understand that Beyonce had issued a country album. The owners of the station pointed out that they had two other stations which were playing Beyonce's music. It was just a matter of genre, and they love Beyonce. They've played Beyonce for many years on their other stations. They were eager to say, how thorough of a racial reckoning do we need to go through over this album? What do you guys think?
I must admit, my sentiment is simply just one of let people enjoy things. It doesn't matter if different groups like different things. Like, we constantly have these articles in the British press about how there are not enough people of color who enjoy countryside walks. I mean, I don't even know if this is true or not, but frankly, it doesn't matter. It's like, if white people want to do white people things and black people want to do black people things, it's all good. In fact, it's more interesting. I don't see that anyone has any obligation to play music. Beyonce's music is not that good in general. I don't see why her country record would be, particularly good by the standards of the genre. It's really a very silly discussion, and that's it. That's all I have to say.
So it's very bizarre. I mean, on one level, this whole discourse is very bizarre. I will say, on the level of the album itself, it seems like there could be a version of this which would just be a kind of celebratory omni-Americanism where, a major star of black music associated with predominantly black genres, is sort of taking on this musical legacy, which is primarily associated with white rural America. Although that is in itself sort of an artificial construct, as I may get into in a second. And that there's something good about this, right? Like that it reflects America's kind of perpetual, mongrelization in the most positive sense, which I tend to be celebratory of. So I don't have an opinion. I haven't listened to the album. I don't have an opinion on it itself, but I don't think there's anything, particularly concerning. And I'd say there's probably something pretty, even though I don't have strong opinions on Beyonce, I think there's probably something overall encouraging about such a development. So then there's sort of the discourse. Now, the example that came to mind when I heard of this was, this guy, Luke Combs, who covered the famous song Fast Car by Tracy Chapman. And, if you just look at the music itself, how it was received, and so on, I think you can largely see it in the terms I just laid out. Chapman herself seemed to be happy about the resurgence of this song, which is a big deal, 30 some years ago. She seemed to like Combs's cover of it, and she indeed appeared and played it alongside him at the Grammys. So that would all seem to be a kind of happy story. But of course, the cultural discourse around it in elite media was completely absurd and kind of loathsome. It managed to claim, things like, first of all, it sort of ludicrously claimed that Chapman had never received the recognition and that this white man was now receiving for playing her music, which is completely absurd because, she did receive quite a lot of recognition.
Can I just
it
butt
was a very
in here
popular song at the time.
and say I was alive and conscious when this song first came out, and it was massive. Like, it was played constantly, like everywhere, all the time, and nobody had any issue with it because everybody loved it. It was like absolutely massive.
Yeah, and so it's like, okay, so and she herself again did not seem to have any problem with it being covered. She seemed to like the cover and gave her endorsement of it in various ways. But nonetheless, you have this kind of cottage industry of journalists trying to turn this into a sort of racial reckoning moment where somehow this black woman's achievement had been appropriated, and it was very stupid. But it did also raise this idea, which was the first I had come across this idea that sort of that country music is racially exclusionary and that it doesn't it's and so it kind of raised this kind of bizarre version of like disparity discourse where presumably, like, what needs to happen is country music needs to have a kind of breakdown of its, musicians where it, perfectly reflects the proportions of the larger society. So, if country music doesn't have somewhere around 15% of its star musicians as Black, then, presumably it's morally failing in some way. So, I mean, and this was raised around some things that I saw published around Combs' hit with Fast Car. But, what's particularly weird about this is that, these musical genres, country, rock, blues, etc. They all kind of emerge more or less in their current or their recognizable forms around the same time with their rise of the studio, sort of commercial music industry. Before that, these genre distinctions aren't very clear. Even arguably after that, they're once you start trying to break them down, they're not very clear. Part of the reason these genres were defined the way they were in the first place did have to do with race. So there's no question of that. The country was defined as sort of white, essentially sort of hillbilly music, right? That was essentially a kind of attempt to, create a marketing category that, more or less reflected and would sort of reinforce the consumption habits of a certain demographic. Is just a very familiar aspect of marketing. It also happened to be the case that, the way that, because the country was relatively segregated at the time, the way that music was distributed, both on the radio and in record stores and so on, did, follow along racial lines. And so, to some extent, the invention of these genres was a kind of product of the racial stratification of America at the time when they were invented, and in a way that did that did serve to reinforce these distinctions, but was also just a kind of predictable reflection of differentiated consumption habits in the way that sort of marketing and the marketing of commercial products tends to be. But it is also interesting if you go to the sort of roots of American music. Obviously, there's just a huge amount of influence between white music, Black music, and if you also just listen to the music of these early decades, coming out of Memphis, Nashville, various other places. It's often, quite hard to tell what exactly differentiates these different, supposed genres of music. And so, in fact, these distinctions were often quite artificial and didn't really capture the realities of the music as it was being played. And so, I think it's kind of weird to, take country music, and I mean, because again, it's also like there's something of a myth about it, as I said, that it's just by its very name associated with like rural white people, presumably, but in some sense, it's a product of urbanization. It comes at. I mean, Nashville is a place where it's sort of slickly commercialized and turned into this mass consumer product. No different than rock and roll at the same time. Bluegrass also emerges as a kind of commercial category around the same time. So these are all kind of artificial constructs that are relatively contingent and emerge out of the music industry. And so it seems like a lot of these debates are just kind of, they're just at a remove from the realities of music itself, and just have to do with the endless rehashing of these ultimately pretty artificial categories. But what's weird is that the people who are having these debates seem not to know very much about any of that, and seem to approach all of this in an extremely reified way. So I don't know. I mean, I find it sort of depressing that that the public discussion goes in this direction, because, even though I don't have a sort of great appreciation of of Beyonce's music, and have not listened to this album, it just seems clear and obvious to me that what's good about American culture is this kind of endless remixing and endless new forms of cultural encounter and cross influences and so on. So, in theory, this should all be something to celebrate, and nevertheless, we're going to get stuck in tedious, completely artificial racial conflicts, and that seems like a shame.
I listened to a song from the album, Jolene, great Dolly Parton song. In the Dolly Parton's original song, the lyrics are really just kind of, they're passive and plaintive. She's just begging. And that's really the charm of the song, notably in Beyonce's reworking of it. There's an attempt to project jealous menace, to say to Jolene, not that I'm begging you, but I'm warning you, stay away from my man. So it's not, I'm begging of you, please don't take my man. It's, I'm warning you, back off, or it's not going to turn out well for you. That kind of warning is a lot more typical of Loretta Lynn, another great country songstress, who has a whole bunch of wonderful songs kind of warning women away from her man. But Beyonce's cover really lacks the wit and humor of Loretta Lynn's music, as well as the pathetic quality of Dolly Parton's original song. So that one kind of fell between two stools for me. If you want some kind of great kind of country R&B crossover, I recommend a song by a figure I mentioned earlier in the podcast, Big Al Downing, whose song I'll Be Holding On was remixed by Tom Moulton, the great DJ and kind of remixer who did so much for that kind of musical culture of gay clubs early on. And that song, especially as remixed by Moulton, I think, is a much better example of what the omni-Americanism that Jeff rightly commends can achieve. So with that, thanks, Jeff and Nina. Thanks to you, listeners. If you're just a listener and not a subscriber, go to compactmag.com/subscribe to get everything we publish. Right now we have up on the site Sraba Mari's incredibly moving report from Artsakh in Armenia. It's an oral history in which he interviews several women displaced from Artsakh, the historic Armenian community, by Azerbaijan. The title is The Passion of Artsakh, and it's a very important piece of journalism. So compactmag.com/subscribe.